Well, good morning. It's good to talk to a group like this where you certainly will understand better what I say than most groups. It's very difficult sometimes to get across some of the concepts that are important to people who don't understand them very well. One of the biggest things people don't seem to understand is how TCP works, and that's one of the biggest problems we're facing in trying to fix the network, is to take account of all of the characteristics of this protocol that was designed so long ago and still needs some work. In any case, what I'm going to try and cover is some of the history and some of the problems that were created in the beginning and are still there, and what some of the things that we need to do now and that I've been working on to try and improve the situation. So back in '65, I did this first experiment between two computers at MIT, and that was over a telephone line, which proved to me that the telephone network was hopeless for data communications of any serious sort. And so basically designed the concept of a packet network using technology that my office mate Glenn Kleinrock and I have been looking at in terms of switching packets. That led ARPA to, which is ARPA then, not DARPA, but led them to blackmail me into coming to ARPA. You can read about that in some of the books, how they called up the head of Lincoln Lab and said, you've got to send Dr. Roberts here or your funding may be cut off. And so the director of the lab called me and said, I think it's good for all of us if you do this. I didn't really want to go into management at that time, but it turned out to be very effective. And designed the network and built the ARPANET, which quickly grew. In '69, we got the first nodes in the network for four nodes, and by '71, it was 18 nodes like is shown here. You can see what I looked like back in those early days. Not quite the same lines as today. Yeah, somewhat darker here, too, but anyway. Then I turned the office over to Bob Kahn, and he hired at Surf, and they worked on TCP/IP, and in '83 they got that installed in the network. And it kept on growing until it was turned over to NSF and went commercial in '91. In the early period, this is both the traffic in red and the number of hosts in blue, basically very similar curves. It grew pretty rapidly to begin with, and you can see it was down in very low bits per second. But basically, the traffic grew and everything grew much faster once TCP got installed in '83, and there was a worldwide acceptance of one protocol. But even before that, we started out thinking about just sharing resources so that you could get at all the data on all the computers that were around because they were all incompatible. And that was the first goal. But then in '71, Ray Tomlinson at BBN built basic programs that sent and read mail messages. That was virtually like a teletype. So I wrote the programs that did email handling, and I was at ARPA, and we needed to really use it as a function. So I wrote it with a TICO editor, the email programs, and that's been copied ever since. If you use virtually any email program today, they're identical in function to what we built there. Save, look at, resend, transfer, and so on. That took off madly and became the main traffic on the network because it was clearly valuable and easy to use. We started a program in Hawaii on packet radio and then designed a concept which I designed the next revolution of that, which was to make the slots synchronous that they were using for discovering a new sender. And then that's now what we use for Wi-Fi. So basically this technology started back in '72 or so that Wi-Fi is using. It took a long time to get into practice. we built our first actual packet radio network at DARPA, and it started at then, and it got completed around 75. And we also started a link to the UK with satellites, which connected a whole other network of computers in the UK that had different protocol than we had, were interconnected with us, as well as the one in Hawaii that had another protocol too. In about late 71, we had a big demonstration in Washington, the ICCC demo, and that showed everybody in the world that this was feasible, and we had computers all over the world working to, all over the US at that point, working to show people what could be done remotely with computers. That really changed the technology picture in the world. I then took and started Telenet, which we really required now a standard protocol. TCP wasn't done yet, and I started X25. I designed it and standardized that, what's now the ITU. And it was in use for quite a while to manage the early communications, and that's what Telenet was based on at that time. And that allowed us to have a standard worldwide, and we actually, Telenet sold equipment to England and Canada and other countries to build their networks. And then as TCP IP came along in '83, it was put on top of that, so it was totally functional with the network. Now, so what was the network designed as? And basically, it was designed for file transfer and email and basically moving files. And it was really constrained by the high cost of memory. Remember that when we started, we were using little mini computers that had 4K of memory, virtually none by today's standards. And we only looked at the packet destination because even though I believed that we should be looking at the whole flow of data, whole file transfer, or video or voice, or whatever it might be, we didn't think much about video at the time, but we certainly considered voice. We really were concerned that we didn't have enough memory to keep track of the flows, because there were more flows than we could keep track of. They lasted for a longer time. So basically, we only looked at the packet destination and routed the packets to where they were supposed to go. And that was the only thing that could be done at that time. We didn't even check where they came from to make sure it was the right place. Isn't still done today in China, which is really a serious security problem in my mind. But it would cost routers twice as much work, so that's the reason people won't do it. There was really no security. We didn't worry too much about it, although the government used encryption over their segments of the network if they wanted to. But there was no real network security, and still isn't. It was best efforts only, and we did run voice. Danny Cohen did voice experiments and proved that it was quite feasible, and in fact forced Bob Kahn and Surf to add UDP into the protocol stack so that we could do voice. And then we really didn't think video was ever going to become feasible at that point because the bandwidths just weren't there, nor did it appear that video was something that was selling very well. But that changed later on, clearly. So today, basically all the voice is moving over, all the video is moving over. Emergency services have a big problem because the internet has no priority system, and it's been, in fact, avoided by people very consciously because they wanted everybody to be equal. And in fact, without security, priority for individuals is ridiculous because hackers will take it all. So we really have to introduce a very different kind and much more important strong security if we're going to have preference priority for emergency workers. But that's critical for the nation and for even for a corporation in many cases, certainly for the military and for the government. And in fact, I've worked with the President's Council, and they're very anxious to get this kind of capability into the internet. The security is now becoming one of the biggest problems that is around, and is, as you know, there are tens of millions of bots out there who could take over any country at any time and do a denial of service on anybody at any time. Actually, they haven't been used that much for that. They have occasionally, but they're there in fact ready to do that and clearly being used for spam and other various functions. So the problem is very severe, and we need to do a lot more about it. We're leaving it all to the computers today. We're not even paying attention to the network. The network could add a lot, and I'll talk about that a little later. And TCP unfairness is probably the biggest thing hurting our performance today. TCP, I'll get into this, but cloud computing, what we call P2P file transfers, and some other functions are using multiple flows on the internet at one time by one program, and that makes them get more bandwidth, and therefore they can congest everybody else with only a small number of users. So what we see here is a graph of what the traffic has been on the network over time since its inception. And I've been keeping track of this because I had all the government data through NSF, and as it went commercial for a period in 2000, I polled under NDA every carrier to find out what the traffic was, although it was confidential to each carrier, added it together, and could publish the total. And so I got intermediate numbers, and more recently been collecting it from every country and determining where we are. Today, probably 80% or between 50 and 80% of the traffic on the internet is P2P downloads by a few percent of the people. And that's that top red piece. It doesn't look like a lot of it, but it clearly is a good piece of it. Overall, the actual traffic, not including the P2P, has doubled every year since it started, but it's growing much slower today overall because, as you see at the top line, Moore's law basically is constraining the network today because most of the cost is adding equipment, not fiber. And the result is the equipment only comes down in cost every 18 months. And so you can't double the network faster than the equipment comes down unless you want to spend a lot more money. So that as carriers are facing that economic concern and not being able to charge more to each user, they have to obey that law at the moment, unless we had some other innovation. Just one other point on that. It has grown about 10 to the 12 trillion times since we started, and the same structure has worked, although we do have the problems I talked about that are growing. It will grow another 60 to 1 in the next decade, and that basically will cover most of the world, virtually everybody who wants to be connected and has even a little bit of money to have a cell phone or such device. And the traffic per user will go considerably higher too, doubling, going up by 10 to 1 or even much more in the developed countries, so that people will get lots of their video this way. So to support this, there's got to be continuous growth of the network, and to support it, we've got to improve a lot of the quality issues as well and the security issues. So what do we need to change now? These are the big problems. Fairness is a major problem. As I say, up to 80% of the network is currently consumed by a small fraction of the users who don't know that they're overloading the network because their application just is doing it and they don't know what's happening. That they need to be given enough feedback so that they can be fair, that everybody is doing the same thing and getting what they pay for. I'll get into the problems there. Network security, we need to do much better on. I'll get into that. Emergency services can only be done with priority if you have the security. And then priority is quite easy to introduce. And by priority, I mean rate priority, so that it's not just better delay or a better queue. It's a better rate for your activity, which is really what you want. You don't want just slower, less delay because there's not much of that anyway anymore. And we have to improve the cost and the power considerably because if we're going to grow with Moore's law, we're constrained to that 18 months, and actually the users would like to double every year if they could, or thereabouts. So what we would like to do is have some innovative steps, functions that will give us lower cost. And we need to improve the quality and speed of the network considerably. Video and voice have issues today of jitter and loss and stuttering in the video. And TCP often stalls with interactive applications like the web because of packet loss. TCP with multiple packet losses actually stops and waits for seconds. And with XP, may wait forever. XP is a bug. suffering with. So we need improvement, and what I've been working on is looking at the flows rather than just the packets, because historically we were managing everything just by dumping it in a queue and discarding if the queue got filled. With weighted grid, we did somewhat better than that, but basically the same capability. So that creates delay and jitter randomly over all the packets in that queue. You may have multiple queues, so you have different priorities, but basically everything is being done randomly. So TCP may lose 5 packets or 1 packet, and if it loses a bunch of packets in one cycle, it stalls. And so that hurts people substantially and is not necessary. It slows down in any case, but it slows down far too much in that case. UDP is uncontrolled, and as people move to that, and PDP has moved heavily into UDP, then it basically can hurt everything. We haven't seen much video with UDP because video needs to not lose any packets, so it uses TCP in general. But UDP for voice is quite common, and of course is now being used instead of TCP because it may get through the routers more effectively in some cases. But it's not controlled very well, and so it can hurt everything if it's not controlled properly. Flows can be rate controlled, however, individually. So what my alternate concept is, instead of dumping it in a queue and discarding randomly, we look at every flow, and the reason we can do that today is because memory is vastly cheaper than processing. It was much more expensive. So memory has come down in cost much faster than processing. As a result, we can keep track of millions of flows with no trouble. That's the 5-tuple of a packet defines the flow. So we can easily look at the flow, we can record it, and if we hash to get the same flow, then we can just do the same thing we did before with it, write it on the same path, and we can keep track of its rate, we can watch what it is, we can know that it's video or voice, and we can treat it appropriately with the right priority and the right controls and the right security. We don't have to just treat packets randomly. And given that, we can reduce the amount of work we have to do dramatically because there are 14 times as many packets as there are flows. So once I've routed the flow, I'm done, and I don't have to go through that fairly expensive process again with high-speed random access memory. I can use DRAM to keep track of the flows, and I can do the whole thing at about 5 to 10 times less cost of whatever we want to do, whether it's DPI or routing or whatever function. It turns out to be about 5 times less size, power, and cost than it would have been if we did it all with packets. Because most of the packets could just be streamed through. Okay, so the second thing is flows have a predictable rate. They change slowly with time. I mean, with the round trip time is what TCP changes with, which is the majority of the traffic. UDP voice is changing with time very slowly, and it's pretty flat. So what's really going on is that we can really predict a lot better from a flow what's going to happen in the next second than we could from packets. And so given that, if we control the rate of each flow, I can make sure that we can stay at 95% utilization all the time and never have to go over 100 and never have to fall below 90. So we actually can stay at very high utilization without any random discards, just by individually controlling each flow. To do that, what we do is the traffic comes in, the packets come in, we hash all of the 5 tuple together, look at a flow state memory, see if we've seen that flow before. If we haven't, we go to the routing module and decide where it's going and what it's going to do, what we should do with it, what its priority should be, what its rate should be, everything about that flow we should manage, whether it's and send back the information. Okay, this flow should go out that port, and it should have this protocol when it goes out, and it should have this rate. And if we're going to do any rate control by discarding occasionally a packet in that flow, we do it there before it gets into the switching fabric and overloads the switch. Switching fabric is then very cheap. Switching fabric, just switching packets at high speed. And dumping it to the output, which is now doing a load measurement and reconstructing the right protocol in the output, right header on that packet and so on. And we manage every 50 milliseconds, the central processor is notified as to the rate of every group of traffic, of which there may be 10,000 different groups of traffic we're looking at, and we report all those back so that all of the flows within those groups can be given the right rate, at a fair rate for that group. And then those are all then streamed to the output. There's no queuing at the output. It's all just streamed straight through. There's a slight bit of queuing in the switch in case multiple arrivals occur at one time. But now we're in Poisson random arrivals. We're not subject to the kind of fractal behavior of TCP because we're not discarding in the same fashion, and then thus synchronizing all the flows. To manage this at the input, we're doing what we call an intelligent flow delivery instead of some other technique. And here we just watch the rate of the flow, and as it gets to about where we think we have to stop it before it gets to the high point, somewhat over the fair rate for that flow, we discard one packet, no more. And then we wait until the next cycle or two, and we may then discard another packet if we need to. If it gets out of control, like a GDP, and it's just sending indefinitely, we'll actually clip it hard at the higher boundary. But generally, TCP is quite effective this way and stays right within that sawtooth, and it never stalls, and it never gets out of the band, and we control it to the rate we need. And the user gets a much cleaner experience from that than he would otherwise. I'll show you that in a minute. So this is, the second thing about this is if you take now 1,000 flows, well, let's just take 100 since the square root's easier, the variance goes down with the number of flows because it's all random addition and the law of large numbers works. So if I have 100 flows, my standard deviation goes down by a factor of 10. And so instead of being 33%, it goes down to 3%. And with 10,000 flows, it goes down to 0.3%. So I have very little standard deviation as a result. And I can, with a lot of flows, which there are typically over any port going out, then you can maintain a very high level of utilization. This is a itinerary plot of what happens with a discard boundary like a packet router, which is a fixed size queue, or any switch which is discarding with a queue, or any other such device. In the left, basically the rate of the flows runs anywhere from 0, and lots of the flows are stalled at 0, all the way up to a couple megabits momentarily, but mostly running between 0 and 1 megabit. All over the place. You watch any individual flow, it's going up and down all over the place. It isn't, it's always climbing until it gets knocked, and then it goes down to 0 or goes down, not to half, but usually far greater because it usually loses multiple packets. When we run it through our system before that, so that we stay slightly under the clip rate for that queue, then you see what it happens. All the flows are running at the average rate approximately. We don't make them precisely the same because that has a clip effect. And the result is there's no stall flows. And doing the calculations, the average flow web page with 40 flows is delivered 3 times faster because you're not waiting for that one to stall. And that's usually what you're doing. Most of the time you're waiting for the 1 or 2 flows that haven't finished. And that basically is why web pages take a long time in many cases. If you run them all at a constant speed, then basically it comes much faster. We've done this and looked at response time for things like just delivering a megabyte to something. And the response time goes anywhere from 1 to 12 seconds in a particular Wi-Fi experiment. And it would be always 2 seconds with this. In other words, never 12 seconds, which it would be in many cases otherwise. So the worst experience disappears. And that's fairly important. The average is the same. So the impact of flow management at the network edge is, well, the web accesses are 3 times faster. TCP stalls are eliminated. There are no bad cases anymore. The voice is protected so that we don't have any packet loss, and we keep the delay very low. There's no delay because it just flows straight through. We know it's voice. We know that we don't have to discard anything unless it's uncontrolled. And so it just flows through. Video, you have two problems today with TCP video. One is that there is TCP, a lot of TCP losses, and so you have stalls, and then your freeze frame occurs. The other thing that can occur if you're trying to run HD, and I've talked to the studios, and they have serious problems delivering HD, and that is that the HD going through any distance is going to wind up with TCP running too slow, because TCP slows down with delay, with distance. And so if we are trying to go through two routers at two edges that each have 40 milliseconds of delay, plus the long haul delay in the network, we wind up with HD not being able to run anywhere near the speed it needs to, even cross country. So we have to fix that problem. We took out the delay in the routers, that would be fixed. It's virtually all routing delay that's causing that particular problem. The speed of light is still an issue, but can also be attacked with another protocol that we're supporting. I'm not going to get into that, but we do have a protocol that the military has been using on satellites now that called TIA 1039 that will, the network tells you what speed you can run, and so you don't have to wait to jump to your speed. You just jump to the speed the network tells you, and it then can flow at that speed, and so you don't have any long distance delay in terms of your feedback. Fairness. This is a big problem. We have it at every university in major form. We have it at every ISP, and it hits the users far more there than it does the university, because the university, like here at Stanford, has gigabit of capacity into the internet, so usually that's not filled. But an ISP is giving each user what it can afford to give them for their money, and the result is that many users, like myself, get seriously slowed down because the P2P and any other multi-flow application takes the majority of the bandwidth. But in the beginning, we didn't have any problem, because one flow per user with voice or with terminals going to computers, which is basically what we were doing those days, was always, okay, one flow per user. If the flows are equal and have equal capacity, then the users are equal and everybody's happy. So that was fine. It was an accidental result. We didn't plan it that way, but what happened with just discarding randomly and the way TCP works and the way the discards work, if the bigger the flow, the more the discards, then it does tend to average out that flows are equal, even though all over the place and rate individually. Well, where are we now? We're still that way. Things changed. And the result is that computers can generate any number of flows they want. They don't have to have one flow per process. So if I want to deliver iTunes to you, I can use mobile flows, and they do. If I want to deliver P2P, I'm talking to multiple other computers, I can do that with mobile flows. If I'm doing cloud computing and I'm talking to multiple computers in the cloud, I'm getting lots of flows coming to me. Either way, we have multiple flows for one process, for one thing I'm doing. And the result is I get, if I have 1,000 flows, 1,000 times the capacity of my neighbor. And that's fine as so long as I'm not exceeding what the capacity of the network is, but when I'm sharing it with my neighbors, which is what an ISP does, or the university is sharing it on the output link, then I may be destroying what everybody else can do. And the FTP user here is getting, 1/6 of what the P2P user is getting, although in general the P2P user would use a lot more than 6. So we can't stay with equal capacity per flow. That's a mistake of history that we need to change. We need to get to something that is more fair to the average user, not to cut off any particular application, not to say anything's bad, but just to say that you get what you pay for. You don't wind up being able to take from your neighbors without knowing it. Now, most people don't understand. I mean, many of you probably do, but the average user out there has very little clue that they don't have 6 megabits when they buy their service. They have 100 kilobits on the average. And that's effectively what the carriers are assigning them on the average, because that's what the average user uses. So averaged out over 1,000 people, which is typically what either a cable or a DSL provider will be serving with one channel. They basically will be giving maybe 100, maybe 200 kilobits per user on the average. And that's slowly growing, but basically you're sharing it with all those people. That's that final link you're sharing. And so you can peak to 6 megabits or whatever your peak rate is anytime you choose, and it should work. Everything should work fine, and it will. Unless somebody's doing something continuously with multiple flows, in which case they'll get the majority of the bandwidth. With only 0.5% of people running the typical P2P programs, like BitTorrent, they basically will grab all the bandwidth that they can in the network, which is most of all the upstream bandwidth. And they will destroy what everybody else can do to where everybody else is reduced to a very low rate. And they get reasonably good rates. They get about 80% of the capacity if that's going on. Typically, there's 5% of the people who are doing this. So they're competing with themselves. And anywhere between 0.5% and 5%, the average user sees no difference. It's the same. The P2P users are just getting slower service between themselves. So what DPI is doing is trying to cut down that. It cuts it down maybe 3 to 1, but it still doesn't fix the problem anymore because of encryption. I'll get to that. So where are we today? Well, what's happened is that the normal traffic, this is linear scale for that other graph, has been growing very slowly. And the P2P has been growing hugely because it's easy to take and it's easy to get. And it works quite well, and people can download videos very easily. The result is that it has compressed what average users can do so that I can't do more web accesses per second than a certain amount. I don't try to because I can't. And therefore, my traffic just doesn't grow, and my applications don't change. I can't do much. And that's probably why the average growth is so slow for those people, because they don't have the bandwidth to do it. This is what's happening in terms of 3 different levels of controlling the multi-flow applications. If there's no regulation at all, and this is a particular case of an asymmetric DSL ISP providing service to 1,000 users, and if there's no regulation, the average users will get a very small fraction of the bandwidth, and the P2P users will get the majority of it. This is on the upstream channel, which is not the main one that the average user wants to use, but his ACKs have to go down this channel. And his ACKs are slowed down just as much as everything else, and therefore his downstream is slowed way down because of the upstream. The DPI gets in there and cuts it down from 100%. It maybe finds 70%, 75 or 80% of the P2P and destroys it, kills it, resets it, does whatever it does to it. But that doesn't change anything because you're still over 0.5%. And so the result is the remaining people who are encrypting their flows take over, and they compete and take over that 80% of the capacity. And so the average user is seeing no gain. And the other other P2P users just switch to encryption and solve their problem that way. If you went to equal capacity per user rather than equal capacity per flow, then you get what's finally over there. And that's not that hard, to just look at how much each user is using and give him what he paid for, and controlling his rate in total for no matter how many flows he's using to the same as everybody else under congestion. If there's no congestion, everybody can take what they want. But if there is congestion, you want to give people a fair share of it. Then the DPI is not a good way to approach it, because I'm looking for a particular signature, and that's very hard to do. What you do is just look at the traffic and the number of flows the user is using. It's much easier to do. And we do that now quite effectively. So the inequality today is because of equal capacity per flow. That has to change, or we'll destroy the network. The network will die if more users and more applications figure out that by using multiple flows they can solve their problem. I don't know why FTP hasn't been delivered with 100 flows, but it could be. And as soon as that happens, we'll see everybody die, because we won't have any ports left. NAT won't work. So we'll kill the network. Everybody will compete and go on to where everybody's using as many flows as they can. It's a major worldwide problem. It's everywhere in the world, and it's not that P2P is bad. P2P is very effective in many cases. But what it shouldn't be allowed to do is not know where its boundary is. It should know that it can only have this much bandwidth and take it and use it effectively. This is when we turn on our flow management and we look at the number of flows each user is using, and if he's using 1,000 flows, we give him lower rate per flow, and basically he gets his fair share. Everybody else gets their fair share. The normal traffic goes way up, and the PDP traffic goes down to the percentage that's there, which in this case was 1.6. This is a major university in California, and this is in going on today and controlling the traffic. Now the universities have two problems. One is the RIAA and the studios are complaining bitterly about them stealing. That's a particular issue with P2P that I'm not particularly concerned at. The universities do have to worry about it. But I'm really concerned about the fairness because the normal users have been ruined. And I see this every day with my Comcast connection. And I watch it with Wireshark and I see all the resets and the lost packets and I just get sick. But I can't fix that. In fact, I actually, I know exactly what's going on in their network and how it works as well, but I can't get them to change it. It's a long process. They've got their own problems to fix. I understand their problems too. Every carrier in the world is using DPI to try and control this, and they're all losing the battle because it's virtually impossible with DPI. But just looking at signatures. It has to be fixed by going to equal capacity per user. And if we do that, then people won't jump to multiple flows to solve their problem. So why is it important? Well, it's because of all the reasons I just gave. You've got to provide a fair boundary with the network. It can't just be based on the application figuring out. There's no way for an application to figure out that it's using too much bandwidth. And the multi-flows are misleading all of you. I've talked to people who are developing new video applications who say, oh, the way to go is with P2P because it's more cost effective. Well, it is for that person, but not for the world. It's costing your neighbors all their money, and it's costing the ISP a huge amount, but, well, it's really costing your neighbors. But it would be much cheaper to deliver that video from a server that was on a 10 gig link in a cloud. Much cheaper than from another home. So the result is it's the wrong way to do video delivery. It may be the right way to do it if you're doing it legally, but if you're doing it for commercial purposes, it's actually a bad decision for the world. It may be a good one for the provider until people fix it. And that's the problem we're facing. Economically today, if I was BBC and they did this, they went and offered P2P, and they destroyed the UK network. And they backed off of it because they saw that it was a problem. But that was, in fact, looked to them like the best solution to offer video. So I'm going to switch to security. Now, you people know the value of watching communications. I sit there and the only way I can figure out what everything is happening in my machine, it's not telling me what it's doing, but what all these applications are doing is to watch the communications. There's a program that was developed by SRI that is available, that is downloadable, that will find a bot on your machine by watching all the communications. If you have a bot, like Conflicker, which is hard to find, what they do is they just watch all the communications, and within a day, it will have talked to the right people, and they will have seen that you have Conflicker. And so it will tell you what bots are on your machine, and that's the best way to do it. Not looking for signatures. It's almost impossible to find some of these bots nowadays. But it is quite feasible to watch their communications. And so that's, in fact, the right way to go about a lot of security today. It's not being done significantly. Doing that on every machine is awkward. But doing it on the network would be quite reasonable to look at all the communications and find everybody who had bots. We haven't done that yet. I would like to do it, but the government's got to fund it. Somebody's going to do it. Because we don't really have the money to do this kind of thing from venture capital. Security isn't paid for by people very much. The government does have to put money in. And they only put $100 million into the whole program that was started in the new administration, which is peanuts, to do this, solve the problem. Today, the network's open and unchecked. anybody can connect to any computer using a false address, any address they want. You can put any IP address on your packet you feel like. Nobody knows where it came from after it's gone through one or two routers. There's no way to check it. The routers don't check where it came from. And by the time it arrives at your machine, you don't know who it is or what's going on, and so you let it come in unless you've blocked every port and they're very careful. And so people are working on the computers doing everything they can think of to fix every bug, but that's virtually impossible. And the result is if we had the network do more, we could do a lot better. And it would tell you who was calling you, and it would check it, make sure that it was them, and they were authenticated. Now that interacts with privacy issues to a certain extent, and we've got to cope with that, but as opposed to having my banking ruined and my country destroyed, I'd very be willing to have some privacy laws, especially when I can go through intermediate systems that give me the ability to be anonymous to a certain extent under the law. So that the reality is we've got to do something, and this is what's being attacked at the moment in terms of that. DARPA has a new project which we're working on, which is a protocol which I designed many years ago to, based on the 1039 protocol I talked about before, where you're now talking about the flows in the first packet. So the first packet that the user sends has attached to it his ID, encrypted ID, his PKI signature, and some other information that lets the network check his authentication and make sure that it's really him who he says he is. And if he is an emergency worker, assign him the right priority so that he can use higher bandwidth, or if he's a general in the army or whatever, or he's under fire, or he's in a hurricane zone and he's an emergency worker, the priority can go up even further. So there's all sorts of conditions that set the priority that are based on that authentication. There's also the fact that the network now knows it's a legitimate user. He may have a bot, so we may still have a problem, but we can watch that communications and look for that as well. The corporations have many priority requirements as well. In almost every case I come across, they say this application, my download of my new version of my software has got priority over everything else. I've got to get it through on time. And so they know what to assign priority to, and we do that in the network now. We can provide priority for any application, but we can't do it for a user without the security. We can do it in the network because we are in control. The corporation is managing the settings. But when we're doing it and the user can say, I'd like this priority, then we have to go to something where the network checks his security. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this, but the way it works is the sender sends his first piece of information. He authenticates himself with a AAA server. The network can send to do the same thing, and so can the receiver. So you know who's sending to you. You know that it's a legitimate person, and you know you're willing to accept that call. You don't have to accept a call from a random person in China, which is the majority of the calls I get. Or the Ukraine, one of the two. That is under development, so it will take a while, but when it's done, it can help considerably provide security in the network. The kind of equipment we're using is this small piece of equipment, a 1RU system. It handles 40 gigabits of capacity, either 4 10 gig ports or 48 1 gig ports, or any mixture of the 4 modules. And this system really scales from 100 megabits up to 40 gigabits as far as actual installations go, and the pricing is scaled accordingly. And so basically, it is about 5 times smaller and less power, 300 watts, than an equivalent machine of the same generation and age, and with full layer 3 routing, with the full capability of layer 3 routing. That's a minor function today. The routing is sort of a commodity function. So we're not even calling it a router because that's something we can do. We can look at like a pump in a wire as well. So either way. The point is that if it's valuable, we can do it. The main thing is to manage the flows, manage the priorities of the flows, the fairness, the rates, and smooth out the communications so it works well. Manage the P2P control, all of the things I just talked about, as well as the security and other things as we can get those installed. So this reduces the cost of the network by a factor of about 5 to 1. If you were to use this at the edge of the network, in the core of the network, we should be using optical anyway. So basically, the network, and when I looked at the total cost of the network, if we use optical in the core and flow switching technology at the edge, we could reduce the cost of the network by an order of magnitude. And that would, in fact, allow us to make a step jump in how much capacity we can offer people. It wouldn't be every year we gain that. We have to have a new development after 3 or 4 years. But it gives us one step, which is what we need at the moment to make video work effectively. So basically what today's IP network need is substantial improvement. We've stayed the same for 40 years. I've been trying to change it. We now have the technology to change it. Thought ATM might do it, but it wasn't done right, and it was different, and that was unfortunate. But and it was out-of-band signaling, which was the worst part of it. It has to be in-band like TCP. We wouldn't get the response time we needed otherwise, and that was the biggest mistake ATM made. The fairness in the networks is terrible because of this equal capacity per flow. We've got to change that rule at any congestion point. We've got to fix the response time in QoS and not throw random packets away, but throw correct packets away. That's relatively straightforward to do and much cheaper. And the security's got to be improved, and that's one of the things that I'm now spending more time on, although it's not in the product at this time. It will be in a few years. But we've got to improve the security of the network. It's one of the biggest problems that the world's facing today. Conflicker is got 10 million bots and is run by a corporation in the Ukraine, which has got about 140 people, and that's its whole business. And now the latest release of it is bringing a thing up on your screen and saying, if you want to get rid of this bot that your computer has, pay us $50 and we'll get rid of it. No, they don't, but they charge you $50. And so they're making their money that way. We didn't know what they were going to do to make money. But all of a sudden we found out that they have this little technique of tricking people into paying. I'm sure they'll think of another technique next year. But those same bots can be used to destroy any country they want to and stop the war or do anything they feel like. And that's a serious issue. So that's the picture. I'll open it for questions.
In one of your early slides, it looked like the flow management needed to really know the capacity of the output node. How much of the benefits of flow management do require this communication between the input node and the output node, or at least the exchange of information?
Well, we always do that because how do you decide what rate this flow should be without knowing what it's competing with? Now, at the output node, you may have a port, you may have a VLAN within it that should only be so much, and you may have a class within that should only have so much. In other words, you're saying that HR should only have 2 megabits, and so on, or should have this relative priority to other functions in the corporation. So we manage each of those groups, about 8,000 different groups of traffic. Feed that back, it's not much work. And then that takes care of making sure that, in fact, we always are within that 90 to 99% window. If there's the traffic, if there's no traffic. Yeah.
Yeah, is the technologies you're proposing, are they similar to ATM in that what they do is they're signaling set aside bandwidth end-to-end through all the critical routers and switches, and then once the guaranteed bandwidth end-to-end can be established, it allows the flow to propagate.
Yeah, TI 1039, which is now being completed in the ITU this year as the ITU equivalent to 1039, is a protocol which the modified TCP driver in your computer will say, I'd like a gigabit. And the network, the first router in the network says, no, I only can give you 10 megabits. And one later on may say, I only can give you 5. and it gets to the other end, gets reflected back, and you know you can run at 5 megabits. And every 128 packets, you do the same thing, or every second. And so you get a reset of what rate you can run.
What's that proposed standard or standard called?
The standard that's in place is TIA, the TIA Telecommunications Industry Association Protocol 1039. So TIA 1039 is a descriptor you can get on the net pretty easily. The one in the ITU hasn't got a formal name yet. It's still in progress, but it will come out at the end of the year. Similar, in fact, virtually identical. And the IETF has refused to look at it so far, so I've had trouble with that. But yes?
You hinted during your talk that security was the next problem you were possibly thinking about trying to solve. I was wondering how you're approaching that, what sub-problem you're trying to solve in terms of security.
Well, the first problem is this one that DARPA is funding. And that's a large program. It's about a $100 million program that they're funding to do the security I talked about, where you do authentication of the sender. So the network and the end receiver, if you choose, can find who's sending. You can restrict it so that only the network knows or the end user, but basically it provides the mechanism for you to identify the sender and them to be authenticated securely with a thing. Now, what you have to do there is slightly more complicated than I've made it sound, because you can't afford to send that data all the time. So, and you have to keep on doing it, something, because somebody could take over the communications or spoof it. So what we do is we send it once when the user logs in, his heavy identification, and then he sends a short encrypted code with each flow and updates that occasionally. So every 120 packets we've been updated as to the security, but with a very simple one that lasts for the duration of the flow.
So around the same subject, around authentication, you're dealing with the internet or you're dealing with enterprise networks.
Either one.
So if you look at it, to authenticate, you have to know the identity, right, of who's coming across. How's the identity and the access management issue being handled by DARPA?
The concept is that the user has a PKI certificate that he's or she has obtained, and their computer may have one too. But the person is also important here. So they provide their certificate with a card or it's in their computer with a password or whatever. And that's a full PKI certificate. That's unbreakable, basically. And that is sent, the first time they log into the network, the first time they do, that is sent to a AAA server somewhere in the network that has the database and identifies that is correct for that person. When they send that certain information to the network could also check it, and so can the receiver.
So do you foresee that the future is that, like right now the internet is wide open, anybody can go on the internet, who knows who's out there, you can have any identity. Do you foresee that in the future internet users will eventually be identified via certificates?
I believe that. My belief is that in the near term, what we'll see is the governments and military use it, and maybe corporations. But shortly thereafter, the banks may say, if you want to use our online banking, you better get a certificate for yourself. Now, you don't have to use it, everything you do. You can do some of your communications unidentified if you want to go to your porn sites or whatever. But you better use it when you do banking. And then the bank will let you on.
Do you think that there'll be some sort of governing body that's going to have, issue out certificates and based on, like the DMV, for example, you have to go there, verify who you are, and you can give or a passport,
The military already has it. So under this program, that's already in place. And everybody has a card with that on. So that's totally in place for the military. They wear it around their neck all the time. There's a card reader that they swipe it when they log on. We're going to have to go to something like that for the people. I don't know exactly who will administrate it. That's a government problem.
Right. Because that's a global issue.
Yeah, and the mechanism's all in place. People like VeriSign do this all day long.
Right.
But people haven't got certificates. That's the problem we've got to take on. And so when the bank asks you to do this, they'll have to have formed some group that does that, or the government hopefully will do it. I don't know how that will take place. What I know is, to begin with, the government and the military will start doing it. And then as we see the huge problem in identity theft and so on, I think banks and others will take it on. And I'd like to handle it from my email, too. So I know who's sending to me, and they know who I am, so that, it's with your email server you communicate. But basically, I would like to cut out the spam that way. And then nobody could send to me that wasn't certified. And if they did, I could send a note to somebody saying this person's sending me spam, and they'd be arrested or stopped or whatever. See, the whole point is you can then get back to them legally. Even if they do it, you can know they were. And so they can't get away with it indefinitely if they have a certificate, and they can't send to you if they don't. Or you may block it. That's up to you. I don't know how it will go through the human process of the individuals. I certainly know how the corporations and the government will use it.
Right, so as a corporation, I'd like to see how that can be addressed internally where I work. But I'm looking at it from a global perspective. That's a very expensive infrastructure to put in place and to manage. And who would fund it, and who would be the governing body if you're talking about globally?
I don't think it's that difficult to do, but I don't know who would do it. Clearly we're depending on the DMV in a lot of cases today. It could be them. It could be it's Social Security. It's not clear to me which body would do it, but it's relatively straightforward to do. I mean, as I say, it's widespread in corporations and the government already. Mechanisms in place. Yeah.
One more question?
These are real problems you've identified, and as you speak, this is a wonderful way of attacking this, and at the same time, I'm thinking about all the trust that I have in the government to manage this. And I'm remembering the cost to news workers of criticizing presidents in the past and then being audited. And I'm trying to imagine part of your scenario that can allow for the anonymous user.
Well, I think if you're doing this all the time, and you don't have to do it all the time. As I said, you could switch on your computer to not use your user. You could also go through an anonymous computer. And that computer would have the ability to be searched by law under subpoena, but otherwise you're anonymous. And that would protect most everything I can think of. I mean, I'd go through it if I didn't want my ex-wife to know who was sending her these things, but if I did something bad, then the government could get me. Anyway, I don't think we can go into that in great depth, but it is something that clearly within the government organizations they can put in place quickly. Within the individual thing, it's much harder, as we've talked about, and how privacy is handled. But personally, I've come to the point of view that I'd much rather operate under that environment than not. I'm getting tired of the difficulty that I have today. And you watch for everything all day long. It's very hard to be on the network today without, if you know it's bad out there, you're worrying all the time. Okay, we better stop.